Hello, everyone, and peace be with the righteous ones of you. I hope you're doing well. So we continue with our program. Last we spoke, we talked about Ethiopian aggression against Eritreans, at least 2 years into the so-called federation. By the way, I want to make a correction. So the federation was not supposed to end in independence. Technically, it was. I'll mention why, but it was supposed to end with a referendum. But the result would have been independence because the Eritreans had been wanting independence anyway. Ethiopia, they broke the rules of the federation. They broke everything. They violated the federation. They broke the promise, which was not a surprise to some people from the UN. And so, in any case, we went over what they were doing. They would scrap the symbols that represented Eritrean identity. They would they removed the flag, the Eritrean flag. They were cutting the pole. They cut. Not only did they remove the flag, but they cut the pole that would carry the flag, perhaps to make a point, basically, like, to hell with you guys, to hell with Eritrea, to hell with the federation. They imprisoned journalists and writers. They muzzled the press. They did everything that Isaias Afwerki does, but some people still defend Isaias Afwerki. I don't have the time to talk about that right now, but whoever does defend Isaias Afwerki, there's no difference between you and the Ethiopian regimes which abused Eritreans. In any case, that's what we talked about last time. We talked about Mr. Walde Jesus Ammar's 6th grade teacher who was infuriated by the things like the flag being removed. Okay, so where we left off. Yes, so where we left off is that where it said that Eritrea. So before anything, I begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. I praise and I glorify him as he ought to be praised and glorified. Eritrea is run as a police state, said Earl Ritchie, the American consul Earl Ritchie. Eritrea is run as a police state insofar as political opposition is concerned, devoid of any free or opposition press, and with a populace denied the political and other rights guaranteed to them by their constitution. Eritrea is today anything but the autonomous and democratic unit envisioned by the framers of the United Nations resolution. That's Earl Ritchie, American consul to State Department, Foreign Service Dispatch 775.00/6-2959. As quoted by Takiye Fissahatzion, page 17 of Mr. Fissahatzion's writing. The Ethiopians succeeded to kill the Eritrean institutions, their economy, and their desire to be left alone to live in peace after many years of conflicts. The federation was already defunct before it was officially voted out by the Eritrean Assembly. On the 14th of November 1962, and Haile Selassie I's order number 27 of the same day. So the Ethiopians, they succeeded to kill the Eritrean institutions, their economy, and their desire to be left alone to live in peace after many years of conflict. The federation was already defunct before it was officially voted out by the Eritrean Assembly. On the 14th of November 1962, and Haile Selassie I's order, Haile Selassie I's order number 27 of the same day. So in the footnote it says, members of the Eritrean Assembly were guaranteed to receive their salaries for life. Accordingly, the legislators had been paid until March 1974 for life, until March 1974. This fact was presented as a reader's letter by the author in the Ethiopian Herald during that spring of free press in Ethiopia of 1974. So there's a quote which follows by by Dawit Wolde Georgis. I'm not going to read it because the Red Sea Press didn't want me mentioning any of their content regarding anything that they have, so I'm not going to read the quote. I don't know if they would mind, but I'm not going to do anything because it's from a source that's published by that publishing company. So I'll skip it. Anyway, but the stunned Eritreans were not at that point ready to confront and stop Ethiopia's flagrant violations of their national right and identity built through years of common suffering under alien rulers. The Eritrean elite, be those at home or abroad, including those in Ethiopia, were already rebels at heart. So the Eritrean elite were already rebels at heart, although it still took them quite some time to convince themselves that victory against the formidable emperor's country was possible. It took them some time to realize that victory against the emperor's country was possible. A start was to be made soon with a few active participants. C. External factors. Ethiopia's ill-advised destruction of the nascent democratic experiment in Eritrea and the measures it took to strangulate the territory's economic base were by themselves sufficient to rouse a rebellion. Yet, some external factors were essential to ignite a nationalist movement out of the divided and frustrated Eritrean social milieu. The new Eritrean generation could not help being strongly influenced by the global decolonization process, as well as the rising tide of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. So the Eritrean generation could not help being strongly influenced by global decolonization and the rising Arab nationalism in the Middle East. 1. Decolonization. So let's go until the end of this chapter, and we'll finish there, because then comes part 2. Okay. 1. Decolonization. Decolonization, sponsored by the same world organization that sealed the fate of Eritrea, allowed many new states to attain independence without the requirements that Eritrea was expected to possess. In the year 1960, 16 African states became independent. Young Eritrean nationalists were interested in comparing most of those states with Eritrea. Many of them had lesser population and smaller area than Eritrea's. No one was questioning their economic viability, nor was ethno-religious affinity of neighboring states taken into consideration on granting colonial peoples the right to self-determination. So, nor was ethno-religious affinity of neighboring states taken into consideration on granting colonial peoples the right to self-determination. Furthermore, none of those former colonies was denied independence because another landlocked state had the right of access to the sea, just like what's happening now, similar to what's happening now. So none of those former colonies was denied independence because another landlocked state, like Ethiopia, had the right of access to the sea. The author's generation was infuriated. The author meaning what Mr. Walde Jesus, if I'm not mistaken. The author's generation was infuriated because these were the main arguments presented at the UN General Assembly to deny Eritrea the attainment of independence. The UN did Eritrea dirty. This type of envy by the young Eritreans was shared by the frustrated older generation, which wished Eritrea's politics of the Adde era, or the period of inquiries for Eritrea's disposal, would be replayed. So they wished for Eritrea's politics of the Adde era, or the period of inquiries for Eritrea's disposal, would be replayed. In many respects, it was true that so the Eritrean elders, they wished for that time when the disposal of Eritrea was being decided, they wished it could be replayed. They wished it could be happen again. In many respects, it was true that the political developments in Eritrea during the 1940s foreshadowed the rise of African nationalism across the continent a decade later. But unfortunately for the Eritreans, they were perhaps too early. The international stage was not yet set for decolonization, and that first skirmish with European colonialism was met with a solid, united front of opposition from the colonial powers. So the political developments in Eritrea during the 1940s foreshadowed the rise of African nationalism across the continent of Africa a decade later. But unfortunately for the Eritreans, they were perhaps too early. The international stage was not yet set for decolonization, and that first skirmish, that first skirmish with European colonialism was met with a solid united front of opposition from the colonial powers. That's found in Connell. I forget the source, but it was mentioned earlier on. So the colonial powers were united solidly against that decolonization desire. Or rather, the stage was not set for decolonization because and that first skirmish with European colonialism, a solid united front was standing in front of it. So it couldn't happen, or it wouldn't happen. Rather, I won't say it could not. It would not happen, because it could have. Anything is possible. And when the stage was set for granting almost unqualified independence to former colonial entities, when the stage was set for granting almost unqualified independence to former colonial entities, some Eritreans felt perhaps it was not too late to demand the right to self-determination for their country. 2. Arab nationalism. I printed these out in order. Anyway, so I was just making sure they're in order because we already... Okay, 2, Arab nationalism. And this is the end of this would be the end of part 1. Part 2 will be Eritrea, liberation war, and refugees. 2, Arab nationalism. So 1 was decolonization. 2 is Arab nationalism. 2, Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism could well be cited as another pertinent factor as to why some Eritreans, though of an armed national liberation struggle in the early 1960s. Is this a typo, or am I making a mistake? Arab nationalism could well be cited as another pertinent factor as to why some Eritreans thought, so the T is not there, no problem. Okay, so Arab nationalism could well be cited as another pertinent factor as to why some Eritreans thought of an armed national liberation struggle in the early 1960s. The urban Eritrean Muslims, most of them in the business sector, had easy access to the mass media. They had adequate knowledge of the Arabic language, thanks to the British and later on the federal periods, to absorb what was being beamed from the Arab world and other Arabic language broadcasts. So they had access to the Arabic language and Arabic broadcasts thanks to the British and later on the federal periods. Eritrea's western neighbor, the Sudan, became independent in 1956. The charismatic Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser was becoming a symbol of secular nationalism in the region. Many African exiles were assisted to conduct nationalist mobilization from Egypt. The Eritrean community in Cairo, consisting of exiled political leaders and young students, was bombarded with ideas of revolution and liberation struggle. Similarly, the armed liberation struggle in Algeria was a clear example that had to be emulated by all nationalists worth the name of being nationalists, if I'm not mistaken. By the year 1960, therefore, it was becoming more and more probable that the winds of the nationalist revolution would influence also Eritrea. The subjective factor for an armed struggle was furnished. So, the subjective factor for an armed struggle was furnished. That's the end of part 1 of the book, Eritrea, Root Causes of War and Refugees by Mr. Walde Jesus Ammar. Now, when it comes to Jamal Abdel Nasser and his movement, so they led a secular pan-Arab movement, him and others. He was connected with, he himself was a socialist, a Marxist. Abdel Nasser, who doesn't deserve such a name because it means servant of God. Nasser is one of the names of God. I believe Nasser means one who assists, An-Nasser is the one who helps, the one who assists. It's one of the names of God. Abdel Nasser was secular, and he, as well as Muammar al-Qaddafi and Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, and I believe Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein, even the at least one predecessor of Saddam, these people were part of a secular movement. This secular Arab movement would prove to be a failure. Why? Because, in my view, it was the socialist way and the Marxist way. It doesn't last. It doesn't carry any benefit with it. For those of us who are Muslims or who identify with Islam, Marxism never worked for us. It never works. It fails. It always fails. It does the people dirty. It does itself dirty. And you saw what happened to each of those leaders. So Abdel Nasser was they say poisoned, I think. Abdel Nasser was poisoned. Qaddafi, you saw his end. Al-Qaddafi. Yasser Arafat, they say, was poisoned, even though he didn't carry much power. Saddam was found in a hole. Bashar al-Assad ended up fleeing the country. I mean, their ideology didn't last. When the Zionist entity took over Palestine in 1948, the Arabs decided to fight against them. And the war which comes to mind is the 6-Day War of 1967. The Arabs were defeated in 6 days. 6 days. In 6 days they were defeated by the Zionists. You had Iraq with Palestine, with Egypt, with Syria, with Jordan, and others who worked against, who fought against the Zionists. They lost. One might argue that the West supported the Zionists. Yeah, but you have all these countries surrounding them and they couldn't defeat them. They couldn't defeat the Zionists. Socialism doesn't carry with it any spiritual benefit. As a Muslim and as someone who does his best to practice his religion, I have to mention spirituality. I'm not going to put. I'm not the person who tells you that the mosque is there and politics is here. If someone says that the mosque is there and politics is here, he didn't understand Islam. He didn't understand what Islam is. He doesn't understand Islam. He doesn't understand politics. He doesn't understand neither one. Because you need Islam to understand politics, and Islam encompasses politics. And if you understand politics truly, and if you understand justice, you would have to understand your religion, which you call Islam, which you say is Islam. Islam is politics. If Islam is not politics, then where did the caliphates come from? Where did the concept of khilafah come from? And if you don't agree with the khilafah, where did the concept of imamah come from? So there is something called imamah, and there is something called imamat, and something called caliphate. There is something called that. If someone wants to say, well, the prophets were not politicians, what did Moses do? Who did Moses go and talk to? Who did he and Aaron go to face? Did they did they live in a cave? Did they stay inside some kind of a monastery, a temple? Where were they? They went and faced the king of the land, the Pharaoh himself. And what about their descendants? What about Joseph? What did Joseph become? He became a minister under the Pharaoh of his time. And he was a reliable one at that, in my understanding. Solomon and David, both of whom were descendants of Jacob, who's Israel. Jacob is Israel. They were both kings. Abraham went in front of Nimrod, the guy that got a bug went inside of his nose and ate his brain and killed him. Nimrod was a king. Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon all of the prophets, including Muhammad, sent letters to kings and leaders around him, inviting them to Islam. How much politics was included in that time? In the Quran, you'll find a lot of politics. So, spiritually speaking, you cannot mix something which is un-Islamic with something which is Islamic. You cannot do that. God will not support you. And if he does, it might just be fine. He might just be leaving you alone. Fine. Here's what you want. This is what you want. You'll get it. But for a temporary period, and then there is punishment awaiting. So these socialist movements did not have any blessings. No blessings. Eritrea, unfortunately, took those as an example, and it didn't work out the way people wanted it to work out. Not with the ELF. We're going to see what happened. Not with the ELF, Eritrean Liberation Front, or with the EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front. But the EPLF liberated Eritrea. It doesn't matter, because the EPLF was corrupt in itself. We'll go over that. Either in this session or in this series or another series. The EPLF was not a clean movement. It was not clean. It was a dirty movement. And anyone who knows and has studied the EPLF would know that it was a dirty movement. And now you have Eritrea suffering at the hands of basically some of the leadership of that so-called movement. Independence came, but what followed it? The EPLF adopted a Maoist ideology. Unfortunately, Mr. Uthman Sabbeh sent people like Isaias and others to China, where they absorbed and learned ideologies which are openly against Islam and Christianity. Openly. And those are the two dominant religions of Eritrea. They're openly against Islam, openly against Christianity. So for those of you who are Muslim or Christian, and you're proud, and you go around carrying an Eritrean flag, the red one, the one with the triangle and the two, I guess at that point they're wheat plants or whatever you would call them. If you go around carrying that flag, then the sad truth is that you're carrying a Marxist, a representation of Marxism. If you don't believe me, look it up. That's what it is. So how can if you claim to worship Jesus Christ, peace and blessings be upon him and upon his mother, if you claim to worship Jesus, you worship him, and at the same time you carry a flag which represents what goes against Jesus Christ and against Christianity, then this is a big contradiction and a hypocrisy. For those of you who don't know, you may not know, you may not understand, you may be politically illiterate. I believe Mr. Walde Jesus mentions this pair of words, politically illiterate. Someone, you don't understand. You're socially, you're spiritually illiterate and politically illiterate, or one of the two. You cannot combine something which is against an ideology which is against an ideology. You cannot combine the two. Would you combine Nazism with Judaism? It's what you're doing is similar. Same for the Muslim. Marxism does not work for neither Christianity nor Islam. Doesn't work for this one nor that one. It's against it. And this is where one of the biggest mistakes comes into play, where the people don't speak up against that. Due to maybe ignorance, maybe being overwhelmed by emotion, stubbornness. This might be the reason. Stubbornness, ignorance meaning lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of an objective way of thinking and a fair way of thinking, and more of a subjective way of thinking, emotional way of thinking. So this is how someone can defend someone like Isaias Afwerki. You know, when people defend Gaddafi, even though the man was corrupt as it gets, they say that there were no homeless people. They say that their schooling was free. They say that, housing was free. People had, people were living well. They say that. You can't say that about Eritrea. You can't even get close. You cannot get even an ant, the head of an ant's measure close to that, to what Gaddafi had going on in Libya. You can't get close to that in Eritrea. And don't talk to me about sanctions and whatever. Syria had sanctions. My father is Syrian. It had sanctions. People still lived. You could still live in Syria. Nobody was trying to escape Syria. Syria had sanctions. Iran has sanctions. People can still visit Iran. Even those who are against the government go and visit Iran. They go visit Iran. They enjoy their country. They have a lot to see over there. Don't talk to me about sanctions. If it wasn't for the Italian architecture in Eritrea, like Asmara, if it wasn't for that architecture, Asmara would be it would be better. You know why? Because nature would overcome everything. Instead of the sight for sore eyes, seeing all this old, ghastly, scary architecture, instead of seeing that, you'd see trees or plants, maybe wildlife or something. You wouldn't see these buildings. Don't talk to me about sanctions. There are many countries with sanctions, but people can still live. Eritrea was more than capable of being something better. Not better is too light of a word. With being the best. But look at what happens when the people adopt the wrong ideology, and when it's not just about Isaias. It's also about the behavior of the people, the mentality of the people, the approach of the people. the way the people's hearts function. How do these people approach things? This is why in the world there is such thing as a follower and a leader. There is such thing as someone who's intelligent and someone who's stupid. It exists. Someone intelligent exists, someone stupid exists. Do you guys think, do you guys think that in the world, that those people who are subject to slavery, do you think that all of them were, do you think that they were all under systems that were advanced? Part of the reason why they were subject to slavery and conquest is because they did not have a system which was strong enough to defend themselves. Part of the reason, I say. Why? Because they were innocent. They didn't have any, a lot of them were innocent. They didn't have any intention to go and invade anyone else. Another reason is that kings were selling them, like African kings. They were allowing it to happen, including the old kingdom of Abyssinia, Aksum. They didn't go and fight on behalf of slaves. If I'm not wrong, I could be wrong, but they may have had slaves themselves. So, what is the cause of slavery? Why is it one group of people that is subject to colonization and conquest? Why is it one group and not other groups as much as the other group, and the other groups are able to defend themselves? Why can the Persians defend themselves? Why can the Turks defend themselves? Why could the Muslims defend themselves? Now they're separate. Look what happened to them. But look at how come they were able to defend themselves? How did they conquer Persia? How did they drive out the Byzantines? How did it happen? Why is it that in certain places in the world, why do they live in such poverty? Why do they have a system which is so weak? Why? Because of the mentality, because of the culture that they're following. It's a culture that does not promote defense of human intellect. It doesn't involve human intellect. It involves emotions. It involves primitive ways of living. It involves stupidity. This is the reason. Has nothing to do with skin color. Nubians were black, but they had something. What it consisted of, I don't support their ideologies. I don't support any of that. But they had a system. They had a civilization. Aksum, same. But Aksum was Aksum in a way, Aksum cheated in a way. Why do I say cheated? Not cheated. That's not the right word. I take that word back. Aksum had a head start. Why? Because Aksum had influence from the Arabs, from across the. If you disagree with me, consult the text. Don't argue with Sami. You can argue with me, but don't argue with Sami. Argue with the texts. Argue with the history. Aksum had influence from across the water. So. Why? The thinking, this primitive thinking has to change. Not Eritreans, not all of them have primitive thinking. But what happens is those who have this butcher's way of thinking, savage's way of thinking, like Isaias. These people who have that way of thinking, they ruin it for everyone. These people are supposed to be exiled. They're supposed to be exiled from the land. You're not supposed to allow such people to have a small drop of water's worth or a mustard seed's worth of power. People die, people starve, people run away, people escape. It's a shoot to kill policy in Eritrea. In many or if not all cases. If you try to escape, shoot to kill. At the same time, there are people living abroad who pay money to Eritrea. What was the reason Brigade Nahamadu was crashing those parties? Because those festivals that were being held, the money would go to the government. It wouldn't go to the streets of Asmara. Asmara looks like a dump. Look at Asmara. It looks like a dump. A ghetto here in the United States of America, a ghetto here, maybe in Michigan or Illinois or in California or New York might look better than Asmara. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. They have infrastructure there. They have internet there. Malcolm X, Malcolm X was, he was a man who used to be, who was a gangster, who was a pimp, if I'm not mistaken, he was a hustler. He became a major leader, an intellectual. In Eritrea, if you do what he did, become an intellectual and speak, you won't get one chance to go on any microphone. You may get a chance to say a few words, but after that, you're taken away. So to conclude this episode, the government of Eritrea is the modern-day Haile Selassie Mengistu hybrid, plus some more evil involved. That's what it is. That's the modern day. What Ethiopia used to be, that's what the PFDJ is now, Hugdef. That's what it is right now. You cannot deny it without lying, or without being someone who's just looking out for his family, or without being someone who's paid, or without being someone who's stupid, or someone who's a liar. 5 reasons. That's how many I named, right? You'd have to be a liar, an idiot, traitor. In any case, next time we're going to go over part 2, Eritrea, Liberation War and Refugees. We're going to start with its introduction, the formative stage in Eritrea's gradual buildup as an identifiable entity, recounted in part 1, culminated in a bloody conflict which lasted 30 years. We're going to talk about that. So we're going to continue our adventure with this text. We owe our thanks to Mr. Walde Jesus Ammar, one of the early pioneers who struggled for the liberty, justice, and freedom of Eritrea. He's the one who wrote this book, Mr. Walde Jesus Ammar. The book is called Eritrea, Root Causes of War and Refugees. And I encourage all of you out there to look it up. You can find it in PDF format online. God willing, I hope that it can be republished and be put on the market to be sold and distributed throughout the world.